All right, well, so we're going to go ahead and get started, even though folks are still logging in, because we have two guest speakers today, and I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions and comments. And thank to the SDG9 team that is hosting today. So we can go on to our next slide. So just a reminder, as we moving into the Thanksgiving holiday for the US students, that we will not have class next week. And the class after next week will be on December 2nd, will be sort of our closeout lecture for this combined class for this year, which is pretty exciting to have made through an entire semester with a lot of different institutions involved. And that will be hosted by SDG 11. So the SDG 11 team will be hosting our closeout class. And then the last activity will be the virtual conference. And a quick reminder to everyone to mute yourself. That gets a little bit background noise. So next slide. So just a reminder for the FDG teams that this Friday is the deadline to submit your abstract. So the Yay Fellows will be working with you to make sure the abstracts get submitted. It doesn't need to be, it's not a very long form. And the Yay Fellows have got an abstract confirmation form that they'll send out, or that Emma is in charge of sending out. So just be aware that we do need to get that in by Friday, and that all members of your team do need to be registered. And then the last time you'll have a chance to practice as a team during the class time will be on December 2nd. And then again, we go full bore on December 9th with the actual conference. And next slide. And just sort of a quick reminder, because this is many different universities involved, there are a lot of students in your teams who are receiving a full grade based on their presentation. So it's important that we all get a chance to work together to get our final products, because some people's grades are based on that final product. But also be reminded that during the conference, part of what we are requiring is that you as an individual do 2 peer reviews of other posters that will be presented during the conference. And for those students getting a grade, that is part of your grade, is to actually participate in the conference by reviewing 2 other posters. And all those posters will be up on the conference's websites. There are 2 sites, so you'll get instructions on how to do that. But while you are getting ready for your final, do take a look at the most amazing website put together by our colleagues at Monash University and Michigan Tech. There's some instructional videos on how to get your presentations together, what the abstracts look like, etc. So that'll be a great central place for information. Again, thanks to the students who worked hard on getting that website up. So again, get your abstracts in by midnight on Friday, Mountain US time. That's early morning Australian time, midday, evening time sometime for people in the UK. So just be mindful of that. And it's like 1 o'clock in the morning for those of you in Peru. All right, next slide. So again, this is a conference. Remember, you can also either use a Q code or go directly to the conference site. Just do make sure you're registered in both places. And only 1 person per team needs to upload the abstract, but everyone needs to register. All right, next slide. It's about all the quick reminder slides I had. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Allie.
Yes, thank you, Gillian, and welcome again, everyone. My name is Allie Murphy-Paletto, and I'm the SDG Fellow for group number 9. And we have 2 exceptional women with us here today who I'm very excited to introduce. The first is Alice Madden, and I'm going to let them do a synopsis of themselves to maximize their time. But I do suggest that you Google both of them because they're pretty remarkable and have quite a few accomplishments. The next is Dr. Leah Dundon, who's actually our PI for SDG 9, and she'll be going second. And again, I'm going to let them do a synopsis of themselves, but thank you so much for both being here, and we're very excited to hear from you. So I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to Alice. Oh, in addition, before I do that, if you have any questions, please submit those in the group chat, and I'll make sure to relay those to both of them.
And just one last reminder to everyone to please include the name of your institution in your screen. So like Emily at CSU. So again, so our speakers can see the different universities involved. Thank you. Alice, I think you're muted.
There. How's that?
Better.
And can you all see my screen? Have I successfully shared my screen?
Yes, we can see it. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Well, first of all, thank you, Gillian, and thanks for everyone who has helped organize this. I'm excited to meet you all. Doing anything with Gillian Bowser is always an adventure, so I'm always excited to be asked. A little bit about me before I dive in. I'm a lawyer by training, and I went into politics, served in the Colorado State House for 8 years, became majority leader in the State House, and really worked on a lot of clean energy and climate issues at that time. I went on to be Governor Bill Ritter, the governor of Colorado's climate change advisor. I held a chair at the University of Colorado Denver on sustainability. I worked in the Obama administration at the Department of Energy, and now I run the Getches Wilkinson Center at CU Law School. So I'm a lawyer, policymaker, and politician. So I think the perspective that I can bring today and what I want to talk about is the politics, the political and monetary influences that have really stymied rational climate change mitigation practices and policies. We are not really slowed by lack of technology. I think we're going to see massive leapfrogging in things like battery and storage technology. We're not really slowed by lack of capital, although I think the investment coffers are going to begin to reopen under a Biden administration because they know that there'll be stability and a market for their products. It's really because of a lack of political will, and political will is often dictated by the desire of large donors who have become very adept at shaping public policy. So you kind of wonder, scientists have told us what's going to happen. Why aren't we addressing it? So I'm going to go through a little bit of that background. So this was a nonpartisan movement in the beginning. First Earth Day was 1970 when 20 million Americans took to the streets to protest pollution. We probably haven't seen anything since then, Earth Day and the Vietnam protests until this last summer. And it worked. There were some very visible environmental problems happening at that time. A river literally caught on fire. There was a really effective Keep America Beautiful public service announcement about pollution and trash. PSAs like "Don't be a litter bug." And I know most of you have grown up. When I was growing up, people would throw stuff out their car windows. I mean, people littered constantly, and there was a real national effort to stop that behavior. Love canal illnesses really upset the entire country. You had children going to school on, playgrounds that had a foot of dirt covering toxic waste. At 3 Mile Island, the nuclear leak, DDT was ruining robin's eggs, and Joni Mitchell wrote an amazing song about it. All this came into the American lexicon, and people acted. There was a legal framework that started at this time under President Nixon, of all presidents. I know a lot of people wouldn't think that's the person who signed all these laws, but the EPA was established, the Clean Air Act was passed, the Clean Water Act was passed, and the Endangered Species Act was passed by a Republican. I think from all accounts, people would consider a conservative president. This is also when environmental organizations were formed. The NRDC in particular is a good example of an organization that formed and started filing lawsuits. Before, there wasn't a way to even file lawsuits against polluters. So those laws I just referred to gave people standing to sue to hold polluters to account. If the government wasn't going to do it, groups like NRDC and EDF could put their feet to the fire. And I can't emphasize enough the bipartisan concern about climate. So this is 1986. Ronald Reagan is president. The Senate's led by Republicans, and they're asking the EPA administrator to study climate change. Let me just let that sink in for a moment. And we had the Montreal Protocol Treaty signed in '87, and the legislation passed under George Bush under the Clean Air Act. And that addressed, that was an international approach to dealing with the ozone problem. And America was considered a leader in that effort. So again, let that sink in a little bit of where we are now. And the last I wanted to mention, because these were just such an amazing public service announcements that were called the Red Couch Campaign. And you can look them up. They're kind of amusing. They would put a red couch in a very unusual setting. There was one with Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich, who of course, polar opposites. The couch was on the beach, and they were both talking about how important it was to act on climate change. Since then, Newt Gingrich has called that the single most stupid thing he's ever done. So that's how far, again, it has changed. And another one was Al Sharpton and Reverend Robertson together in the middle of a busy street in DC with the red couch. So they were eye-catching public service announcements on national television not that long ago, in 2008. So what happened? And again, I mentioned this at the beginning, you often see political will follows the money behind it. So oil and gas industry and conservative philanthropists starting getting really engaged with funding the type of people they thought who would protect their interests, and really starting to spend money on a lot of lobbyists to talk to the people who were in power. And then they really started fixating on campaigning and electing friendly people. But Exxon spent $55 million over 6 years on lobbying beginning in the 2000s. That same decade, Drexel University did a study that tracked, and it's hard to track this money, $558 million from 140 different philanthropic foundations that are considered denier organizations. Here, I'm going to try to diminish my thing so I can see all the slides. There we go. And then the Koch brothers, who I think everyone has heard of, although one has since passed away, have poured millions and millions of dollars into what they would call a free market or libertarian think tank, and into campaigns themselves. And one of the ways to think about why this all happened and when they started really realizing how much money they could use. This article was published in 2012, but they saw the writing on the wall before. So Bill McKibben, who's the founder of 350.org, published an article in Rolling Stone that talked about how much, frankly, pointed out how much money they would lose if they left their product in the ground. And Bill wrote about how much we needed to leave in the ground to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade above our pre-industrial levels. And it really put into very clear perspective how much money they could lose. $20 trillion in assets. So then they got really busy on the politicals and really developing this way to change people's perspectives. And they were very good at it. So this is a really interesting chart. I know it's a little hard to read. I'll walk through it just a little bit. It's from the Oxford Handbook of Climate Change and Society. Work like this and tracking the money takes a lot of time. But basically, it's a way for corporations, fossil fuel companies, conservative foundations, or individuals to kind of hide how they're spending their money. So they create conservative think tanks, and they're really ways to provide talking points for conservative media, for a range of publications or blogs that are skeptical about climate change. and they provide backup for conservative legislative and policy positions. And then there's front groups, often, with really great sounding names that can be out there, on Fox News, et cetera, spreading that message. And of course, we now have revolving doors from directly from political office or high agency positions into these think tanks at really nice salaries, or even for the corporations. We're all really familiar with the echo chamber that is developed. We have designer news. You can find a news station to back up whatever opinion you want to feel comfortable with. We have new ones now, like Oanon, that have really taken on. Fox News and has been around for quite a while. People like Limbaugh, Breitbart has really come into strength with Donald Trump supporting them and quoting them. And they were really successful at labeling environmentalists as extremists and anti-American, and of course socialists. They were able to push mainstream media into both sidesing these arguments when there really was no both sides. I mean, if you get a cancer diagnosis from 9 doctors, you're not going to go see the one doctor who says you're fine. And that's what they did. They would have that one guy who said everything was fine next to a Nobel Prize winning climate scientist. And then the AstroTurf organizations at the bottom, they're funded again by industry think tanks, et cetera, and they can appear as grassroots, very folksy things. Americans for Prosperity is a Koch brothers funded group that was created by the American Petroleum Institute. They're still very, very active in campaigns, excuse me, and messaging. They, believe me, they've attacked a lot of friends I know. Their recent campaign slogan was global warming alarmism, lost jobs, higher taxes, less freedom. So that kind of gives you the idea. The other thing that's developed over the last few years is something called a donor's trust. It's another way to kind of hide your money. So instead of giving money straight to, I don't know, Heritage Foundation, you could give it to a donor's trust. And then that donor's trust could fund whatever conservative issue that you find, to your personal liking, but you don't want to be connected to it directly. So people who track this money do really, excellent work. I just wanted to mention too, when I was first elected to office in 2000, I started receiving 3 glossy magazines a month from the Heartland Institute. One was on the economy, one on health, one on the environment. The environment one would have like full page ads saying things like, worried about global warming? Don't be. And then they'd have some spiel about why you didn't need to worry about global warming. That was 2000. It's 2020. I just quit receiving those magazines, 3 a month, when I moved about 4 years ago. So I'm one of how many state legislators around the country? So think how much money they are pouring into this. And they're pretty good. I mean, I had colleagues who didn't really realize that this was, really advocacy and not a fact-based publication. ALEC is a really interesting organization as well. They work with state legislatures. They will give you cookie cutter legislation on a silver platter with witnesses, all the talking points. They're very effective. When I was first elected, the state of Colorado was sending my Republican colleagues to ALEC conferences on the taxpayer's dime. That's how much power they had. And when I asked to go to a non-ALEC conference, they said, no, we wouldn't send you to that. I mean, it was just incredibly hypocritical. So when I became majority leader, we quit sending anybody to anywhere on the public dime. And they often work together and have been successful in stopping things like net metering or renewable portfolio standards. So I want to skip to a different, kind of the next topic. I want to talk about the 2 most extremes, I shouldn't say extremes, but 2 really different approaches. So how Obama has approached climate energy, and a little bit how about the Trump administration has. I love this picture. This is in Denver, Colorado, signing the American Recovery Act into law in 2009. That's Governor Ritter right there, my boss, of course, Biden and Obama. The guy who's introducing them lives about 2 miles from me. He started a residential solar company and now has started a a federally insured credit union that gives low interest loans to people who want to buy electric vehicles or put solar on their roof. He's just an amazing guy. And he got to introduce the President of the United States when this was passed. Obama put $27 billion into energy efficiency and renewable technology, both monetary support and technical support. And then policy-wise, and I'll just run through these because I'm sure you've heard about them. There was a fuel standards overhaul. There was methane rules, both on public lands and private lands through Interior and through EPA. There was more ozone regulations. There was the Clean Power Plan for utilities, things like appliance standards and LEDs. And, you probably heard about the war on light bulbs that, started, via Fox News. But your refrigerator used to be something that could literally make, your electricity go off. It took so much energy. And now it's like running a light bulb. It's just, these are things that save money for the consumers. And of course, the Paris Climate Agreement. And just as an aside, Biden has said he's going to invest $400 billion over 10 years as just part of a broad mobilization of public investment in clean energy and innovation and what he's calling just transitions. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how Trump has approached this. And I frankly can't even keep up with this. I put 70 plus, I think it's now over 90 plus, and I just did this presentation a couple of weeks ago. It's really hard to keep track of the things that they are trying to undo. And you can see the areas that they are sort of attacking. And, it's probably been our darkest days at Interior and EPA with basically buddy deals directly to people who have access to people in power. And they say, I'm losing money because of this mercury rule. It's like, okay, well, we'll get rid of that mercury rule. It's been that transactional. And just a couple of things to mention, and you may already know this. The Clean Power Plan was actually accepted by almost every state, and the EPA worked for years traveling the country, talking to governors, utilities about how they could reduce their carbons emissions, and many of those utilities just kept doing it, even though Trump said they didn't have to. More sadly, things like taking away justification for restricting mercury emissions, stuff that actually kills you. And then they undid the fuel standards, and the folks in Detroit didn't even ask for this. It was just more of this obsession with trying to undo. Sorry, I put my timer on, so I know. Now I don't know how to undo it. Sorry. There. I didn't want to go over. And the Interior has been opening up its lands for, of course, commercial process, including last week requesting bids to go into the Arctic wilderness area for drilling. So they're not really stopping. These are just a list of some of the legal challenges, many of which are been successful because the administration has been somewhat inept about this and not following the rules about how you have to have public meetings and things like that. You can find this at a website that Columbia Law School has. It's pretty fascinating. I will mention there's a couple of new claims. The city of Boulder and a county in Colorado are part of these new claims under what's called tort law. That might be like if you slipped and fell and cracked your head open and at a grocery store because no one had mopped up. It's considered a negligent claim under tort law. So these governments have sued oil and gas companies under things like trespass, nuisance, and for the costs that they've had to spend because of the damages from climate change. And I'll end with this slide, and I'm happy to come back to this. But as we think about how states act, it's really a mosaic. Each state has, different problems and different sources of greenhouse gases, so the solutions will obviously vary. Here in Colorado, our car traffic has dropped drastically since March, but our emissions dropped very little because oil and gas operations have continued, and there's just massive fugitive gases that are emitted. And then, of course, we still have most of our power coming from coal plants. Maine and much of the Northeast is heated by home heating oil, and New Jersey is things like ports and harbors. So I had a couple more slides, but I'm going to just stop there, quit sharing my screen, and then I look forward to taking questions and talking to you all more about this later.
Thank you so much, Alice. I think we're going to have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end where we can do questions for both of you. So Dr. Dundon, if you would like to begin.
Okay, can you all hear me? And can you see my slides? Okay,
Yes,
and let me see if I can change my, okay, great. And can you see my slides changing? Okay, great. Hi. So my name's Leah Dundon. Ali introduced us a little bit. I have a background in, I've actually been a practitioner for many years. I work at a law firm called Beveridge and Diamond, which is an environmental law firm based in Washington, D.C. And I worked there for about 17 years before I went back to school and got a PhD. So sort of a mid-career switch to academia, although I still practice at my law firm. So I really wear two hats, a private law lawyer in the environmental world, and also I work at Vanderbilt as a research scientist and a lecturer, and I teach a class on climate change. So this slide is really just, I know there's many people from all over, but if you can see, just wanted to show you where Vanderbilt is on the map. We're in Nashville, Tennessee, and that's where my university is. So I'm just gonna go through a little, I thought Alice's presentation was really such a great segue into some of the stuff that I'm gonna be talking about, and really set up the situation that we're in now really well and why we got there. So I'm going to talk some specifics on what the laws are in the US that we can use to address climate change. And then I'm also going to talk about infrastructure, sort of as an example of some of the things that I'll be talking about in the legal world, because I'm actually part of the SDG 9 group for this networking group, and wanted to also touch on infrastructure. So the two main laws that we really use to talk about climate change are the Clean Air Act and NEPA. The Clean Air Act was really designed, obviously, to control emissions to the atmosphere. Oh, and I do just want to back up and point out, Alice noted that a lot of Republican presidents were really held the presidency while a lot of these environmental acts took place. And one of the main reasons for that, I think, and that I've heard others say the same thing, is that Democrats always want environmental laws to be passed. And if Republicans in Congress will often feel a need to push back against that. But if the party in power of the presidency is the Republicans, then the Republicans in Congress essentially have a little bit of a cover for them to vote for environmental laws. So it's actually easier at times to get environmental laws passed when the Republican is in the presidency, which I find kind of interesting. And if you look back at most of the main environmental laws in this country, it's been under Republican administrations. So the Clean Air Act, unlike some of the other statutes, is really a collection of programs. It's not just one individual program. And interestingly enough, if I didn't have this underlined, you might not guess that the key to regulating and addressing climate change is actually found in the motor vehicles program. But I wanted to just give you a little history of what EPA is required to do about greenhouse gases, if anything, and why. And it really started with this seminal case of Massachusetts versus EPA that came out of the Supreme Court. And essentially, some private organizations petitioned EPA, and they said, you know, you have this mandate that means a requirement under the federal statute that Congress wrote. And it said that in the motor vehicles provision, it says you shall regulate any air pollutant from any class of new motor vehicles. So at that point, EPA was not regulating greenhouse gases at all. And these private organizations said to EPA, you know, greenhouse gases are a pollutant, and they endanger public health, if you see that text right there. So this went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did hold that air pollutants, the definition of air pollutants, and by the way, pretty much, if you ever want to be a lawyer, this is the kind of stuff you do. The bottom bullet there, almost every word in that quote has gone all the way up to the Supreme Court and been litigated on what it means. And those are the type of things that you as a lawyer can get involved in, is what does this language mean that Congress gave us? So in Massachusetts.
I am so sorry to interrupt, but I don't think that your slides are switching.
Okay. Are they now?
I don't see it yet.
Okay, what slide do you see?
We're still on the first one.
Okay, let's see. How about now?
I just see your desktop.
Okay. Hold on, let's see here. I might not be able to do presentation mode, but this should work. Can you see them now?
Yes, we're on the PowerPoint home screen, so we can see the slides off to the left and then the normal.
Okay, so but you can see it says Massachusetts EPA at the top?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So that's kind of confusing. But so basically this is the structure of the, do you see a slide that says structure of the CAA? Okay, I think we're back on track then. And sorry about just being able to having to keep it off to the left. But so these are the different titles of the Clean Air Act, and it's the Motor Vehicles Program Title II that I was discussing. This is the Massachusetts versus EPA case, and this bottom section here with these words, what the definition of an air pollutant, every one of those has gone up all the way up to the Supreme Court to be litigated. So after that case, the Supreme Court said greenhouse gases are an they fall within the definition of air pollutant in the Clean Air Act, and EPA has the authority or has the obligation to determine whether air pollutants endanger essentially the public health and welfare. And the Supreme Court also said that welfare can include impacts to weather and climate. So that means that after this case, EPA has the authority to regulate greenhouse gases, but before they must do so, EPA has to make a scientific judgment as to whether greenhouse gases really are a problem. Do they contribute to climate change and endanger public health? And EPA had refused before that to make that judgment. And so the court is essentially saying, you EPA, go back and make that judgment. And that judgment has to be made based on science. It cannot be made based on opinion. And even at that time, even before that, but definitely by 2009, there was so much science that it would have been truly arbitrary and capricious if they had made a different finding. But they did find that greenhouse gases endanger the welfare of people, which means they must regulate it. So this is just a quote from the actual endangerment finding, but the endangerment finding is the linchpin that requires EPA to address climate change effectively. Without it, then EPA has no obligation to regulate greenhouse gases at all under the Clean Air Act. And some people for a while were worried that the endangerment finding might actually be reversed under Trump, but that has not occurred. And I think it would be extremely hard given the science. But not impossible. And then since then, there's been separate endangerment findings about aircraft emissions as well. So the bottom line is that EPA must regulate greenhouse gases, but how do we do that? So under Obama, the plan was the Clean Power Plan that I'm sure you've all heard of. The Clean Power Plan was not only the plan that was going to enable EPA to comply with its obligations under the Clean Air Act, but it was also the US's plan to meet its NDC goals, its nationally determined contribution goals as part of the Paris Agreement. So it would have had a dual effect there. But that plan is now dead, as many of you know, and it's been replaced with the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. And the two are really different because the Affordable Clean Energy Rule really effectively basically relies on energy efficiency to decrease emissions. And there's been some reports that suggest that it's just going to make energy cheaper and actually increase emissions in some ways. The Clean Power Plan was truly, it would have phased out the really high emitting sources like coal and very old and inefficient power plants. So the other one I want to mention, because it's important as well, is NEPA. So this is it's a massive environmental law that in the US that essentially requires you to do nothing except for gather information and look at it. So NEPA requires anytime there's a major federal action with a significant environmental impact, the agency that's doing it has to do this report to comply with NEPA. And the idea behind the law is essentially that if agencies take a really good look at the information, they'll make the right decision on whatever project they're doing. But it doesn't require any particular outcome. They could look at the information and then decide to ignore it. But there's been a huge issue about, well, does it require agencies to look at the climate impacts of their actions? And actions can be an actual project that they're doing, or if they're funding it or providing a loan to even private companies to do things, that can trigger NEPA. And even though this is not written into the law, courts have consistently interpreted NEPA as requiring a look at the climate impacts. And how agencies do that, and different agencies do that in different ways, has been very disparate. So there hasn't been a lot of coordination on what they're supposed to look at, which means everything gets litigated and it all ends up in the courts. In 2016, the CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, they are the implementing group for NEPA. They actually issued guidance on how federal agencies should consider climate impacts, but Trump rescinded that. And all, in my view, my personal opinion is that all that does is just create more uncertainty, and now there's even more litigation about what is an agency supposed to do? What is a NEPA evaluation, an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement? Are they sufficient in the way that they've addressed climate? So that is still out there, in addition to the Clean Air Act, is that agencies must take a look at the climate impacts of their actions. The other thing that happened right after Massachusetts versus EPA is that obviously you can't measure you can't do anything about something that you're not measuring. And so EPA did issue this greenhouse gas reporting rule, and it is simply a reporting rule. It doesn't require any kind of reductions of emissions or anything like that, and it only applies to very large sources. But you do have to report to EPA, and there's this nice website. If anyone's interested, you can search by location and find out what emitters are near you that fall under this rule and what they're reporting. And that is, I think this is a really important program because it's trusted. They had to build up from this program, how do we calculate emissions and how do we report them in a way that people can trust the outcome and compare across different industries and different facilities. And that took a long time, and it has now been done, and I think this program is trusted in the marketplace and also in the regulatory community. Unlike what I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is climate risk disclosure. Their metrics and the reporting requirements for that we're not there yet, and that is causing problem in the marketplace, in my view. A brief comment on the Paris Agreement, and many of you probably know this already just from being in this class, but I'm going to skip that. But this is under the Obama administration. This was the U.S. NDC target. So in other words, this is what the U.S. promised to do to meet its goals under the Paris Agreement. We are already on track for meeting, we're not quite meeting it, but being about halfway there to meet it without doing anything. And mostly that's because of our shift to natural gas and also our increase in energy efficiency. But as you all probably know, even if every single country meets their emissions, meets their NDC promises, we will not meet the 2-degree goal under the Paris Agreement. So this all has a long way to go. And you also probably know that Trump, just because of the timing requirements that are written into the Paris Agreement, Trump couldn't give notice until November 4th of last year that we were going to pull out, but he did so. So on November 4th, we were officially out. But we can rejoin as soon as Biden gets back in, pretty much with a memo or a letter to the right people from the right people. And we will be back in the Paris Agreement within 30 days. But I think it's important to know that the Paris Agreement was simply a promise to really do our best to reduce emissions substantially. And we can still meet those goals, and we can all implement the Paris Agreement. And I think you're seeing that happen in states and cities around the country, that the We Are Still In movement and the amount of work that's been going on in other sectors that are not the federal government, including private industry. And if you're interested in a really well-written article by some very illustrious Republicans that came out just May of June of this year, I really recommend this article because it essentially sets forth in very clear language the benefit to Americans and to our marketplace and our economy and our well-being and our place in the world of really addressing climate and being leaders in this area again. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I think that's a really good article. So this is an area that I work in both for sort of research and policy work that I do at Vanderbilt, but also we're actually helping clients with this. So sometimes people want to know, like, what do you actually do as an environmental lawyer? Well, this is one of the things that clients actually come to us and say, you know, help us get our hands around this. And essentially, we all know that climate change is a risk. It is now an economic risk. It's a risk to businesses. It's a risk to people's well-being. And the World Economic Forum, you know, not your leftist leaning tree hugging organization, this is an economic group, has last year named the top 3 world risks to the world, essentially, for world economics, were climate related. So there's just really no question that climate change is a true risk. Well, so what does that mean for companies and for investors and for shareholders in the private marketplace? And the SEC, so the Securities and Exchange Commission, is the government organization in the U.S. that essentially regulates securities. So if you're a company and you issue a security for sale on the New York Stock Exchange or even privately, there's a good chance that you're covered by the SEC rules. And one of the rules they have is that, and this came out of the Great Depression, is that you have to provide a lot of information that's publicly available about your company. So that if somebody's going to buy a security, buy a share in your company, they have a right to know some information about what's holding up that bottom line. Some of this goes to what Alice was talking about stranded assets, which is if you're an oil and gas company and you're saying your corporation is valued at X billion dollars, well, what goes into calculating that number? Is it that you have a right to burn and will get the money from selling fuel that is currently in the ground? Because if that's true, maybe that's a risk that an investor needs to know about. And the SEC's group is really the one that passes laws and regulations about what you have to put down for the public to look at. And so I'm not going to go into the details, but the main point is that a company must disclose things that are material to the bottom line of the company. So, and the courts have come out with the materiality standard, which is at the bottom of the slide here. And the basic point is that if a reasonable investor, not a sustainable investor, not a green investor, but just a regular reasonable investor would view a fact as immaterial to their decision to buy or sell the security, then you need to disclose it. And so the big question going on in the climate change world right now is, well, what are our risks or opportunities that climate change is presenting, and are they material? And if so, we need to report them. And how do you figure that out? So the SEC was getting a lot of pressure to do something about this problem. And in 2010, they did put out climate risk reporting guidelines. But guidance is simply guidance. It's not binding. And it still didn't really do a lot. Honestly, it basically still said that materiality is the rule. And if it's material, report it. But here are some things that, you know, we want you to know about climate change as well. So what's really driving this movement, which is this movement towards more climate risk disclosure, are shareholders and long-term investors. And by that, I mean like the big institutional investors like the churches, Catholic Church, the state employee pension funds that need to have money in their accounts to pay their pensions to their employees for a very long time. They are starting to go to companies and say, you know, I don't know if you're going to be around in 30 years. I don't know what your climate risks are. And so there is a huge dialogue going on now between that investor group and the shareholder group, and then the companies themselves that are also often saying, some of them are saying we would like to provide this information, but we don't know what you want and we don't know how to gather it. So a group called the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, was established through the Financial Stability Board. And this really shows you how mainstream financial climate risk has gone. This is the sole purpose of the FSB is to maintain financial stability in international markets. It's not to promote any kind of green agenda. It's about financial stability. And they really recognize that climate risk is now a mainstream financial risk. And so this group assembled, there's already a lot of NGOs out there doing this, but this is the very first one that was industry-led. And they established a framework that essentially is providing some framework for companies and shareholders to be able to analyze their climate risk, report on them, and then for investors and shareholders to make more informed decisions. The big problems with with climate risk reporting is uncertainty. Obviously, it's hard to know what's going to happen in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, especially to a specific company that might have assets in very specific parts of the world or rely on specific supply chains. The tragedy of the horizons it's been coined, which I really like the way that that's put, which is essentially that, unfortunately, especially in the US, our corporate cycle of profit and loss reporting is quarterly. And yet climate change is such a long-term problem. You might see, I feel like COVID's actually been a good example of this, because the stock market first went way down and then it went way up. And yet people are still losing their homes and their livelihoods and their workplace and their health. And climate change is similar in terms of it's a very long-term problem, but if you might have a good quarterly return, your stock might go way up, even though maybe it's based on stranded assets that you're not going to be able to sell in 20 or 30 years. And then another problem, sorry.
I did just want to let you know we have about 3 or 4 minutes before we should start transitioning into questions.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And then, so the going first problem also is, what company wants to be the first one in their industry to say, oh, I have really bad climate risks, and here they are. So of course nobody, and that's kind of the issue. So I'm just going to switch very quickly and just say a couple things about infrastructure and climate risk. This picture is the Gold Coast in Australia, and I think it really exemplifies that we love to live on coastal properties. The human species is a coastal dwelling species. We love to build very expensive infrastructure in vulnerable places. And normally, of course, when infrastructure works well, you don't notice it, and we don't notice our power lines, our water lines, until they fail. And the extreme events that are happening in the US are just going to make that more likely. But this is the main slide I just want to show about infrastructure, which is that a stable climate and all of the premises that go with a stable climate are built into all of our assumptions about infrastructure. They're built into our engineering codes, they're built into our water management strategies, they're the basis of our economy, our demands for energy, and what infrastructure we build to respond to that demand. The stable climate is the fundamental principle of that, and that assumption may no longer be valid. And so what happens is that our infrastructure is being stressed beyond, especially the aging infrastructure, which was already stressed, is essentially not functioning as it should, or in places that we need it to. So I'll just end there and turn it back over to Allie.
That was perfect. Thank you so much, Leah. And if the group would like to start sending in questions now to both or one or the other, that would be fantastic. And while we wait for that, I do have some questions that my group prepared prior. So I think I'm going to start with those.
Ellie, you do have a couple of questions in the chat box that are further up.
Okay, Gillian, would you be able to ask those, because I got kicked off halfway through and I didn't see them. I apologize.
I see a question on cap and trade versus carbon tax. I can respond to.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So in my view, I think that's a really great question. And well, all questions are great questions, but I think, in my opinion, while a cap and trade program has some advantages, especially for those companies that are going to take that are going to be less efficient at making the switch to a lower carbon economy, or that are going to be more severely disadvantaged in a low carbon marketplace. A cap and trade program provide some time for companies to get sort of get up to speed or try to join the new world of the new marketplace. But they're really complicated. They're great in full employment for lawyers. But a carbon tax is just much simpler. And in my view, that's the main reason I think a carbon tax is just the way to go. And interestingly, Exxon has devoted $1 million last year to lobbying for a carbon tax. The oil and gas industry and most industries recognize that this is coming, and they would prefer to see a carbon tax because of it's easier to implement. It's easier for the government to implement, but it's also easier to be part of the regulated community. So I'm definitely come down on the side of a carbon tax. It also quickly sends a signal to the market that we are moving towards a low carbon economy. But I'd be interested in Alice's opinion from her perspective.
Yeah, I agree with you. Although part of me is like, unless there is a cap, they just figure out a way to still make money. And, you know, they'll pay the price to do what they want to do. There is this group called the Citizens Climate Lobby. They've been working really hard on this bipartisan approach. I don't think it'll necessarily go anywhere, but it would put a price on carbon, and it's called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And the brilliant part about it is they take that money and give it to people in monthly checks. So it would be incredibly popular. I'd actually rather see something go back into, you know, research and development or something like that. But they've gotten really good. Again, it's Climate Citizens Lobby. They train people how to talk to their representatives. It's an interesting group if you want to look them up. So I think they've made some inroads. They have a little bit of bipartisan support. So it'll be interesting, you know, where this next, you know, Biden administration, and depending on what kind of Senate we have, where we go.
Thank you.
I love the idea of paying the carbon dividends back to people, because I think it suddenly will connect them to climate change and the fact that actually it's all in our economic interest to really address climate change. But yeah.
Yes, and we did have another question from Christy from Colorado State, and he said, what number of these completed or in progress changes can be rolled back easily or at all within a Biden administration? And what time frame for a Biden re-implementation?
You know, there's literally people working on books of what to do on day one on how to roll some of this stuff back. Some of it depends on how well the Trump administration did them. Like I said, there's all those ongoing lawsuits because they didn't necessarily follow the right rules. They had people doing jobs who weren't Senate confirmed. So now they're saying, you know, some of the things that, you know, Mr. Jones did were completely illegitimate because, you know, he had not been Senate confirmed and was acting, you know, without authority. So some of them will be hard to unravel, but literally everyone is tracked and has a plan on how it will be unrolled. Leah, I don't know if you have any more insight on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Just from a procedural standpoint, things that are done, you know, that Trump did by executive order are going to be really easy to undo, or at least a lot easier, because they can be undone by executive order. Things that are done by regulation, just from a statutory matter, take longer. So you have to, EPA or whatever agency has to propose a rule to rescind the old rule, then they've got to propose, and it has to go through notice and comment. I mean, it's just a longer process. So none of those things that were done by rule or statute can be quickly undone, but they can be undone.
And one of our PIs, Sarah Green, was interested to hear a little more about the public trust lawsuits and how they're proceeding.
The last, you know, it's a new form of lawsuit, and I have to say haven't looked at their current status for a couple of months now. So Leah, I don't know if you know where some of them are. They were all still proceeding. And, you know, there was the youth litigation that acted on public trust doctrine saying you owe us clean air and a climate that actually is livable. They've suffered some, you know, tough roads. I think a couple of them are still struggling along.
Maybe you could maybe you could just describe a little bit for the people who might not be familiar with that, like who has standing to bring suits and what kinds of arguments they're up against and what the arguments on their side are.
Sure. So the youth litigation, and I'm sorry, I haven't read about this recently, so I hope I describe it well, was literally a group of young people, one of whom was from Boulder, Colorado, and they sued various governments saying you are violating the public trust, which is in various state constitutions. Colorado's is not that strong, so we're not a good state for public trust arguments. But the public trust is, we the public trust you to take care of us and provide us a livable planet, clean air, clean water. So it was a new way to approach climate change. And Leah, I don't know if you know any more about what the status of the cases now. I just haven't read where any of them are.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I think the Juliana case, which was the one I was following the most, I think it died. If there's anybody in this class or on this call that knows otherwise, let me know.
I'm looking at their website right now on Our Children's Trust.
Yeah, that's
so
it.
It says that the case is currently pending in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, awaiting a ruling on the plaintiff's en banc petition. For rehearing.
Yeah. Okay. So that means they
completely.
Yeah, that basically means they lost, and they're asking for the whole Ninth Circuit. So they lost at a 3-judge panel, and then they're asking for the whole Ninth Circuit to hear the case again. So I don't think my opinion is that that's not going anywhere, but it was still historic. I mean, it was really important and historic, and that should not be overlooked. And there was a district court opinion in there where they won. So the fact that a federal judge was willing to see something in their argument, I think, is really important. And it's all, the public trust also is about the fact that the federal government essentially holds certain public assets in trust, not just for current generations, but for future generations. So it's there, how much the court's willing to read into that, I think often goes to the merits of the remedy being more difficult. Even if you think that their argument is correct, a court's got to be able to order a remedy. And if the remedy is that Congress needs to pass an entire law that changes the whole system, that may be an area that courts are going to say this is not a justiciable controversy. Essentially, it's a political question. So I think that all these arguments are really interesting and really valid and very important.
Thank you both for that. That's a perspective I hadn't thought of, Leah, of course. And another question from Emily is, I've done a bit of looking into TCFD, and I know that there's a lot of uncertainties among companies of exactly how to go about it. Do you have any broad recommendations of strategies?
Well, let's see. I think the biggest, probably the most controversial or uncertain part about TCFD is, because I think it's otherwise very well done. I mean, the framework is very clear. It's kind of like, here are specific metrics that if you can report on them, do so. And some of those are very easily understood and clear. Like, do you have an internal price of carbon? And that basically means that when a company is about to decide whether to invest in something, are they building into that investment decision, the cost of that investment decision, that they may be having to put a price on carbon, that if that project's going to emit X number of metric tons, should they internally put a cost on that? Right now, obviously, it's zero because there's no laws in the US requiring you to put a cost on carbon. But the other part that is difficult is scenarios. So the TCFD asks that companies run scenarios, and this is a little bit more complicated and more difficult. It's really up there, there's some examples, but it's up to the company to decide, do we run a scenario about, well, what if the cost of solar comes down? What if the cost of natural gas comes down even more? What if battery storage does not improve? What if it does improve? How will all these things impact our market for our goods or services? So I guess in terms of suggestions, I think there's a lot of companies are putting out there what they're doing, and looking at what companies are actually reporting under the TCFD framework can be useful. JetBlue, I think, is a good example, and they've got some stuff publicly that they're doing that's very creative, which is essentially they'll say, if a certain extreme weather event increases by X percentage, then we know that's going to reduce our profits by X percent. And so when those X numbers reach a certain number, they will take action. And before that number is reached, they won't. So it's those type of kind of creative scenario thinking that companies are just starting to do. Yeah.
Alice, would you like to add anything to that one?
No, I think that was great.
Okay. And our next question is from Ursula. So please correct me if I think carbon tax works pretty well, but because it's a commodity, it might be affected within the price market, she said, correct? And Ursula, if you could clarify, did you mean as the economy ebbs and flows? Feel free to turn your microphone on. Alrighty, no worries. Oh, yes, okay. So do either of you have any input on that?
Not sure what the question is. The question about I guess I'm not understanding the question. Sorry.
No problem. Ursula, do you mind unmuting yourself and clarifying for our presenters?
Yeah. Hi. Well, I knew about the carbon tax. That basically doesn't work that well because of it works under a commodity price. So that means that the price is fluctuating like from time to time. So.
Oh, okay. So my understanding of the carbon tax, I think I understand what your question is it's not going to fluctuate, but it will increase over time. So in other words, Congress would say here's the carbon tax law. For every metric ton of carbon that you emit, you pay the federal government $40 or $12 or whatever it is. And then that amount would go up over time. And the idea is that, but it's a fixed number per carbon ton emitted. And the idea is that tax essentially would increase until you are hopefully not emitting any carbon at all. Alice, do you have any?
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I heard that basically from someone, and that probably wasn't like good for people that would pay for that for the.
So in other words, you mean you might raise your price of your product just to incorporate the tax? Yes, yeah. And I think that's what Alice was mentioning, something like that. And that's true. That's why the number has to be high enough to incentivize you to move away from carbon. Otherwise, it's just I'll pay to do business.
But the other theory is that it makes dirty sources less competitive. So when the dirty sources become more expensive, then the utilities will want to use more green energy, let's say, because wind is getting so cheap, solar is so cheap, that if the price on carbon goes up, their business people, they'll start to use other sources. I know one very funny utility spokesperson said, we don't marry energy resources, we date them. And when things get too complicated, we leave them. So the carbon tax is a way to make that relationship a little tougher. And one, I don't know how effective it's been. It's, opinions vary, but something called RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's a cooperative cap and trade in the power sector among 10 states in the East, where power plants buy allowances for their emissions. And again, the idea is that it makes dirty sources less competitive. But that's, you could read a little bit about that and learn more about, the kind of the philosophy behind it.
Great. And our next question is from one of our fellows, Macy, and she asked, as the public becomes increasingly aware of the threats of climate change, is this causing corporations to change their behavior, or rather does it lead to greenwashing?
Both. I think, because of just the entire stock market and analysis that Leah went through, people are being forced into this. It might have started with some greenwashing, but now I think there is more action. I think financial incentives and regulations help move corporations. The free market isn't always enough. But every corporate website you go to is going to have their sustainability page, or maybe their climate page, or their corporate responsibility page. So they all know, at least they have to be talking about it. And it also saves them money. These actions, they want to make profit, and sustainable corporate actions save them money. So.
Yeah, I think there's also more pressure now not to do greenwashing. There's actually, it's illegal. Some things are illegal. The FTC is supposed to enforce certain greenwashing claims, but the securities laws that I mentioned are also, these statements about your greenness or your sustainability. If you can argue that those are material, or if a company has said something about them being material in different publications, you got to be careful about what you say. You can't just throw comments out there that aren't really accurate or well researched. If in another publication you're saying something that makes that particular topic material, then you've got the SEC situation, and you've got potentially false statements. And so I think I think climate change is definitely moving into the world where companies need to be very careful about what they say and make sure it's very accurate. We're actually, just to flip my hat to the private practice for a little bit, a lot of our clients are really asking for creative thinking, like not even just solve a legal problem, but what are the big, if we're a big company and we have a lot of money and we really want to do something good for climate change, where should we put that money? Just help us brainstorm. Or how do we reduce our emissions? We have to keep our company going, keep our service or our product being made. But how do we reduce emissions? So I think there's a lot of good actors out there that really are trying to do better. And I'll leave it at that.
I'll just add, there's, Southwestern United States, millions of people rely on the water in the Colorado River. It's over allocated. Every drop is legally supposed to go to certain states. And it's a problem, obviously. More people, drought for 20 plus years now, with 1 or 2 year exceptions thrown in there. There's a lot of corporations who want to do business in the Southwest who realize that's a problem, and they've really taken on in a voluntary capacity water conservation measures, and they're funding outside organizations that do water conservation. So there is a lot of good news out there on that front, because these companies want people to be thriving enough to be able to buy their products. And so the bottom line might be a little selfish, but I've been really pleasantly surprised by the some of the corporate action, and it might even just be funding other organizations to do work that they view as important for being around in 30, 40, 50 years.
Okay, I do want to give you both a chance to have some closing messages, and I might use a question to kind of steer those in a direction. One student from our SDG 9 group asked, what are your opinions on the proposed New Deal, and do you believe that anything should be added to the proposal to help with the change to a low carbon world?
Alice, you want to go first, or? Oh, you're muted.
I think the Green New Deal was a tremendous force, and it's sort of a blueprint for moving forward. It is not a piece of legislation, and so there's many different things inside of it that could go forward and probably should go forward. Someone was just asking me what they thought could happen if the Senate stays in Republican hands. So I'll jump on that a little bit. So one thing that does pass always is the federal budget, And surprisingly, the money to, for example, the Department of Energy has still been pretty robust for research and development. And amazing technology comes out of Department of Energy. I don't think, unless something's changed in the last couple of years, that any battery technology has been developed without help from the Department of Energy, including Tesla, which paid back their loan early because they were so successful. So I think infrastructure investment we've been talking about modernizing our grid for, decades. That actually could happen. I see bipartisan support about that. Conservatives always want to make sure you talk about carbon capture and sequestration, which, the opinions are very different about what, how much that would work. There's always push around nuclear, but nuclear remains incredibly expensive. And the public appetite for nuclear is just low. Expanding things like geothermal. I'm sure that there'll be tax incentives for utility scale storage, battery storage, and addressing wildfires. That's become, a very visible problem throughout. So those are just a few things that I think, no matter who's in charge, that could go forward.
Yeah, I guess I'll end on a sort of a general note. I think it's not legislation right now, and getting there I think is going to be a challenge, even if the Democrats end up with the Senate. I think getting 50 votes in the Senate on a major piece of legislation like that is going to be a challenge. That said, I feel like I want to leave with some optimism, which is we really have an opportunity with climate change in front of us to do something not only in the US, but globally that's incredibly productive and lifting people out of poverty. Alice mentioned leapfrogging, but tremendous leapfrogging around the globe that takes people from having no energy at all to having clean energy. And that could be incredible. And in the US, I'd really like to see rural America supported and brought along and put on the same side as as everybody. If we could all be on the same side on this topic, I think that would really move America in the right direction. And rural America has a lot going for it when it comes to climate change. I mean, the potential in regenerative agriculture. Robert Bonney at Duke is doing some amazing research about forestry, and if we can manage our forests and start building things out of wood like crazy. Wood sequesters carbon for a long time. Use our rural lands instead of for growing grass, but maybe trees, and harvesting them and building things out of them and getting people to have the money from that work. So anyway, I think there's a lot of hope and a lot of potential and a lot of innovation that can happen in the U.S. And I think it will. It's just a question of how long it'll take us to get there.
And there's a huge focus on just transitions, meaning that these are equitable, inclusive rules and regulations that move forward. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement has raised our awareness. And I don't think we're going backwards. I think anything that's happened is going to be done with the light to make sure that these are solutions that work for everyone. So I know we're probably right at the end time. So I want to thank you all, and great questions.
Yes, thank you both. And everybody, if we could turn on our videos and give a round of applause to our two presenters, they can see all of our faces. That would be wonderful.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
Thanks so much to everyone, and thanks to the SDG9 group for hosting an awesome presentation. I know I didn't give you time to do your breakout rooms, but I thought it was best to have our questions. So thanks to all the students for staying to the bitter end and hearing a lot about our laws. And it was nice to hear you both ended on a word of hope that things are moving forward and there's a positive end to think about. So yeah, I just want to really thank you both for a great presentation, and hopefully we'll be able to see some positive changes coming down the pipe very soon now. So thanks all.
I hope at least half of you run for office. Touch with me. I can help plan your political future.
There we go. Let's all run for office. So yay, thanks all. We'll talk to everybody soon. Take care.